It is, as no doubt you can see, you don't need me to tell you, but it's our VBS kickoff tonight, and we'll be enjoying some ice cream and fellowship here in just a little bit. We were at the nursing home service earlier today, and there she is, Miss Adrian, the lovely Miss Adrian Stevenson came with us and helped out, and we were coming back, and I told Adrian, I said, you know, it's VBS kickoff. It feels like I ought to change out of the suit. Maybe I should wear a button up or maybe a VBS t-shirt. What do you think? She said, I think you should wear your VBS shirt. So I said, all right. Adrian came and helped us out. I said, that's what I'm going to do. So we are beginning tonight our VBS. This is kind of, it's always a challenge for me because sometimes the folks will say, now, don't you go and take all our material. But it feels like you need to do something related to the theme. It feels weird to get up here and continue, 38 reasons why you're struggling with relationships when it's VBS kickoff. We'll continue that, God willing, next week. But thinking in terms of, I want to kind of think of a general overview of Daniel, and hopefully that won't get too into the teacher's material, and just a few brief thoughts for us as far as some lessons from the book more generally, and then we'll kind of close out on that. But as far as the book of Daniel, there's a background there. We talked this morning about Moses. God commissions Moses, and Moses is reluctant, but he goes. Finally, God tells him, you're going to be the man, Moses. You're delivering the people. He goes. They leave Egyptian captivity. They wander in the wilderness for 40 years because of the lack of faith. They finally enter into the promised land. Joshua leads them in because Moses was unable to do so. And they're faithful all the days of Joshua, all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua. And then you have the period of the judges. And there's this repeating cycle of sin and oppression. And then they cry out to God, and God sends a deliverer. And then they fall back into sin. And over again you see that cycle. And finally the people say, we want a king. And God gives them a king. Sometimes, we say, be careful what you ask for, because you just might get it. God gives them a king. Wasn't exactly what they thought it would be. Saul became their king, and he turned away from following God. God picks a man after his own heart, David, the son of Jesse, sets him on the throne. Then comes David's son, Solomon. Solomon kind of had his ups and downs. He had some of his idolatrous wives that turned his heart away from God. It does seem at least possible that the book of Ecclesiastes is kind of like a repentance letter from Solomon. But after the death of Solomon, the people come to his son Rehoboam. And they say one of the kind of the heads who leads the people in this request of Rehoboam was a man named Jeroboam. And the people say, your father was pretty hard on us with taxes and such. He's our burden. He's the burden for us. Rehoboam goes and he talks to some of the older counselors, and they say, you want to have some loyal subjects, then do it. He's the burden. You'll have people that'll follow you. They'll serve you all the days of your life, all the days of your kingdom. So Rehoboam then turns and he asks, of course, younger men, the younger advisors, some of his friends from growing up, we might say, and they say, I tell them, you ain't seen nothing. You thought my dad was rough? I'm about to show you what tough is. You're going to see a burden. And as you know, Rehoboam foolishly listened to them. And so Jeroboam says to the people, hey, let them have it. We're going to go and we're just going to form our own kingdom. And it almost comes to a civil war, but God sends a prophet to Rehoboam and says, essentially, stand down, because this is from me. God had a hand in this as punishment for Solomon's idolatry. So the kingdom splits. You have the northern kingdom, Israel. Capital eventually becomes Samaria. Jeroboam, for whatever reason, God told him, he said, if you follow me, I'm going to give you this kingdom, but if you follow me, I'll establish, and you'll have relatives, descendants sitting on the throne for generations to come. But he didn't follow God. He sets up a golden calf. One at Dan, one at Bethel. These golden calves, and it's going to be a stumbling block to the northern kingdom for the entirety, for the duration of that kingdom. The southern kingdom was Judah. You had the tribe of Benjamin, tribe of Judah. And the rest of the other 10 tribes were basically with Jeroboam. They became the northern kingdom. Later on, because of their idolatry, their sin, the northern kingdom is going to fall to the nation of Assyria. It's about, I think it's about 150 or so years later, the southern kingdom, and sometimes the prophets will say to the southern kingdom, you're even more culpable. You're more to be blamed than Israel, the northern kingdom, because it's kind of like in a family when an older sibling does something and gets in big time trouble for it, and you as the younger sibling, you see that, you should take note. It's like mental note, don't ever do that. But sometimes a younger sibling will turn around and do something similar or the same thing, and parents may say, hey, this is just even more unexcusable because you saw what happened with your older sister, your older brother, and you still did this. That's essentially what God says to Judah. You saw what happened to Israel, but you didn't turn back. You just kept on. And eventually, because of their idolatry, and also a lot of coming into play with that was their failure to obey God's commandment to keep the Sabbath. That was specific to the nation of Israel, not a commandment for us today, but it was for them, and they didn't keep it. They served idols, and God finally is long-suffering. He was so patient for so long, and here comes the Babylonians. But this happened sort of in 3 installments, for lack of a better term. You have around 606 BC. Nebuchadnezzar comes, and he takes some captives. In that group was a man. I say a man. Really, it was probably more like, we might say a young man, perhaps even what we might call just a boy, named Daniel. And, of course, Daniel is the focus of our entire study in our entire VBS. There were also 3 other friends of Daniel named Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who went into captivity with him. They were renamed, and sometimes we remember them, strangely enough, more by their Babylonian names than we do their Hebrew names. They were renamed by Nebuchadnezzar, given names that honored his idolatrous gods, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, same people, but just different names. So those young men were with the, best we could tell, were with the first group of captives. Later on, it was maybe 596. Scholars sometimes say 597. You'll sometimes get, give or take a few years. It's hard to say when you're going that far back and you don't have just as meticulous records as we might have today. But somewhere around 596 BC, Nebuchadnezzar comes again. He's going to take more captives. And a lot of folks believe that's when Ezekiel might have been taken captive. Remember, Ezekiel prophesied, wrote the book of Ezekiel, but there's that statement that he makes, I believe it's in chapter 1, where he says, I sat where they sat. He was there among the captives. And then around 586, 585 BC or so, Nebuchadnezzar comes the third time. After the first time, I believe it was after the first time, Judah really was more of a vassal state. The king of Judah was not really a king. He's just a puppet king is what we sometimes say. But the problem is some of the kings, they decided, you know what, I'm not going to serve this king of Babylon anymore. I don't know what they were thinking. Now, had they been thinking, you know, he's an idolatrous king, he's wicked, he's evil, I'm going to look to God, and I'm going to ask God for help. We're going to turn the nation back to the Lord. Had that been their reasoning, that might have got some traction and gone somewhere. But that was not their reasoning. Perhaps they were thinking, he's so far away, what's he going to do? Perhaps they were thinking, sometimes we know that they were thinking because they would try to send money to Egypt. Send us some soldiers. We'll send you some money. Ironically, you know where they got the money quite often is stripping gold from the very temple of Jehovah God. But sometimes they would ask Egypt for help, Syria, other nations, as if they could help them out when they're in rebellion to God. But be that as it may, Nebuchadnezzar would set up a puppet king, and then sometimes they would just say, you know what, we're not going to pay our tribute money anymore. We're not going to follow Nebuchadnezzar. We're just going to kind of declare our independence or whatever. And so Nebuchadnezzar would come again. But that third time, 585, 586 or so BC, Nebuchadnezzar's had about a bait of that, as we say back home. He says, Brother Cates used to use the expression sometimes, I'm going to stop that dog from sucking eggs. Nebuchadnezzar says, we're going to end this. And he comes that third time, and he says, take the walls of Jerusalem, level them. A city without walls is wide open. It's defenseless. He says, level the walls. Oh, that temple of their God, destroy it. Burn it. Cast the stones down. We're going to level this city and burn it with fire. He says, I'm not having them rebelling against me any longer. And somebody might say, as many of the Jews did, what, the temple of God? How can he destroy the temple of God? That's God's house. That represents the presence of God among his people. A lot of the Jews said the same thing. In fact, some of them would even say to a man named Jeremiah, a prophet, when he tried to warn them, and they would say, Jeremiah, nothing's going to happen to us. Look, the temple, God's here. And so in the book of Ezekiel, God's going to give Ezekiel a vision. And in that vision, the Spirit of God leaves the temple. He leaves. And what that means is, it's God's message to his people. I'm not there anymore. You know, some of y'all may be old enough to remember back in the day when they would sometimes get on the intercom, on the PA, after a few minutes, and they would say, Elvis has left the building. Well, God's message to his people was, I have left that building. And you are wide open for attack. What you need to do is stop putting your trust in a building and start following the one who enabled you to build the building, who enables you to do all things. But they didn't. So Nebuchadnezzar comes, he destroys the temple, tears down the walls, he destroys much of the city, burns it with fire, he kills the king. The last thing King Zedekiah saw was his sons being slaughtered in front of him. Then they put out his eyes, and they carry him to Babylon. Like I said, they kill him, they carry him to Babylon captive. But Nebuchadnezzar was, there's some indication in the book of Daniel that he came around later on, but boy, he could be a ruthless person. And you see that there. And some of his what we would call, I guess, generals, commanders in his army, they were pretty ruthless as well. So that's kind of your background when you get to the book of Daniel. That's why you're here. That's why you're reading this book. But here's the thing. Daniel is a young man that, I don't know, we're not told, but it's hard for me to imagine Daniel at some point not thinking, look, I get it. They didn't serve God. They served idols. And they didn't keep the Sabbath, but Daniel maybe is thinking, I serve God. I'm striving to do what God would have me to do. Why am I taken into a foreign land, away from my home, and physically mutilated, and put in a position to serve a pagan king? Why is that happening to me, God? I get that there's punishment for for my, even some of my own forefathers, and they're saying, but why am I having to go through this? Because I didn't have anything to do with that. Maybe he's even thinking, I mentioned a while ago, young man, perhaps what we would call a boy. One of the more popular numbers that I've seen as far as an age for Daniel when he goes into captivity will be like 15, 16, 17 years old, something like that. Maybe he's thinking to himself, why is this happening to me, God? I'm just a kid. I didn't have anything to do with that. And so that's kind of your situation when you get to the book of Daniel. I never study or even think about this book, this person, Daniel, without being struck by his faithfulness in such a difficult circumstance. I talked a little bit this afternoon at the nursing home. They used to tell us in preaching school, whenever we would go out somewhere to preach on the weekend, on Sunday, and sometimes the students would say, I got so much going with my homework for school, and I'm supposed to go out and preach Sunday as well, and I'm teaching Bible class at that congregation. I'm also preaching Sunday night, and I can still hear Brother Cates and some of the other instructors saying, hey, boys, don't make life harder on yourself. Don't double up your workloads as you go. If you're studying in the book of Corinthians in your classes during the week, go preach a lesson from 1 Corinthians on Sunday. So I taught this afternoon about Daniel at the nursing home. But I was talking to them, and one of the things that I mentioned, Daniel is a book about periods of history. Oh, man, and you'll see that this week. I'm not going to tell you about the periods of history. Is that okay, Billy? Can I just leave it at that? Billy's already accosted me, personally, verbally assaulted me, because he found out I was going to be talking about the book of Daniel tonight. So I'm just going to say it's about periods of history, and you'll find out about those this week. But Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, those are kingdoms that are going to be referenced throughout, and even of course with the image, you'll talk about that. What is that? Tuesday night, I believe. Periods of history, and really even Israel's history. We've studied, 2 or 3 times here since I've been at Bremen. I've taught it either in a Sunday class, a Wednesday class, or like a Monday night class. The overview of Old Testament history, you see kind of coming to an end this period that we called it Judah alone. Well, there's the divided kingdom. And then after Israel, the northern kingdom falls, we called that next period Judah alone. And then after Judah alone, you have the period of what we called captivity or exile. And then the last period of Old Testament history would be the restoration, the return from captivity. Daniel covers all of those periods. He seems to be even perhaps just a little bit into that divided kingdom period before. Not before Israel fell, but before Judah actually fell. So it covers a lot of periods of history with that. So it's a book about periods of history, and man, there's some fascinating historical information in the book just from that perspective. But it's also a book about prophecy, and there's so much prophecy. Bremen folks know, I've said it numerous times, the prophecies, particularly in chapter 11, they are so detailed. They are so just spot on and detailed that the liberal critics just about lose their minds. And the best they've come up with is to try to late date the book of Daniel to have him writing more like current events than prophecy. Because they say, nobody could get that exact in their prophecies. Well, they can if they're writing by inspiration, and Daniel was. And it's so exact. That you talk about faith building, you do a deep study of Daniel chapter 11, you'll see it when we get to Daniel chapter 2, this great image, Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Man, there's so much great prophecy in Daniel. And without spoiling, I won't go into all the details of the prophecy with the image because that's going to be Tuesday night at VBS. But boy, the prophecies all really center around chapter 2, and especially that message of verse 44. In the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. Look, ancient Egypt, and in fact, we studied Egypt we studied Exodus at camp this past week up in Tennessee. And one of the things that we talked about in one of our classes was when Israel crosses the Red Sea, the Egyptians try to go in after them, and they end up being drowned when the sea comes back together after God had parted it for Israel. Israel, that's Egypt. I'm tired. It's been a long week. Egypt was not destroyed as a nation at that point. They continued on as a nation. But I do think it is definitely fair to say Egypt was never the same after that. They were never the world power that they were before. Egypt rose, they ascended to great heights of power, and then there you see that kind of ended that. You think about Assyria. Well, they rose to great, great power. Think about Israel, the days of Solomon, and it fell off. Assyria, man, so powerful, conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. Here comes Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, and they conquer Assyria. So Assyria tanks, and there goes the Assyrian Empire. And now you got this magnificent Babylonian Empire. But guess what? The Medes and the Persians come along, and they combine forces, and they overthrow the Babylonians, and now they are no more. Then the Persians kind of rise to the top, and now a lot of times we just refer to that empire as the Persian Empire, because it really became more by the Persian. By the way, you'll see some prophecies about that in the book of Daniel, and even to the prophesying that the Persians would kind of rise more prominently than the Medes. Then you have Alexander the Great that comes along with the Grecian Empire. And boy, I mean, just a rapid rise to power. And then what? Alexander dies and he leaves no heir. And his kingdom is split among 4 generals. And there's the end of the Grecian Empire, because those guys can't do anything but squabble and fight over land and over dominion, like worldly people tend to do. And then, it doesn't happen just all at once, but before long, you have a full-fledged empire that we know now as Rome. And what a magnificent empire it was, and for quite a long time, and yet wasn't conquered by outside forces. Their own immorality, sometimes their own pride, emperors declaring themselves to be a god, and it was like a cancer. It just ate away that empire from the inside. And where's Rome now? Gone. Fast forward. You look at our nation. Many nations all around the world, some great nations, some wealthy nations, powerful nations, prestigious. They won't last forever. But the kingdom of God will last forever. And that is the church of Jesus Christ. The kingdoms of this world, they come and they go. They rise and they fall like the waves of the sea. Some of them are at the crest longer than others, but they all eventually will fall. And God says, don't worry about all the kingdoms of this world. God's not American or Korean or Chinese or Mexican or whatever. God is God. And the church is not tied to any nation or culture or ethnicity. It's tied to the head, Jesus Christ. And it's a kingdom that'll last forever. It's a book about periods of history, about prophecy. It's a book about people. I already mentioned Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Darius, Cyrus. You'll read and study about some of these names, but there are all kinds of people. And really that's what the book's all about, because that's what life's all about. Every person is a soul made in the image of God, a soul that God cares about. I've said it numerous times before. Just because God had that special relationship with Israel doesn't mean he didn't care about other nations. And that is abundantly clear in the book of Daniel, the book of Jonah, and other passages as well. God loved those people. He had a special relationship with Israel because they have his law, and that is the nation through whom the Messiah is coming. But it's not like he looked at the Gentile nations and said, well, I don't really care about them. I really don't care if they live, die, whatever. No, he did and does care about all souls. Just a few quick lessons for us from the book of Daniel. These will just be kind of general lessons. Some of these we've touched on, and I'll just move through them quickly. Number one, Daniel lived the better part of his life in a valley. We've talked a lot on Sunday mornings, once a month, most of the time. Sometimes we've gotten a little bit off because of my being out of town or something, but around once a month we've studied a valley of life and some lessons that we can learn from that. Have you ever stopped to think about there are characters in the Bible that a good, massive chunk of their life was spent in a valley? That's Daniel. I mean, so much of his life, he is living in the valley. Now, there are some good things that happen. He gets promoted, at the end of chapter 1, and Nebuchadnezzar exalts him after he interprets the dream, but he's still a captive, a slave. So much of his life was spent living in a valley, but he was faithful. He was faithful to God. Wasn't perfect, sinless, but he was faithful to God. And I learned from that, adverse circumstances are that's no reason just to say, well, I'm going to just turn away from God. I'm going to compromise. I know that's easier said than done, but boy, maybe we draw strength from Daniel to realize even in bad circumstances, don't turn away from God. Number two, Daniel was a person with a great disposition. We might say, and I was thinking about this in terms of the series that we've been looking at, the 38 reasons why we sometimes struggle in relationships, or again, if you want to use the more blunt title that Brother David Shannon uses, 38 reasons why people may not like us. But one of those was that people often struggle in relationships when they are inflexible, controlling perfectionists. Sometimes life doesn't always go the way we plan, and we need some flexibility. You see that with Daniel. I mean, from going into captivity, he's rolling with that. I don't think he liked that for 1 second. I don't think there's any question that he did not enjoy that. He did not like that. That's not what he wanted. But he rolled with it. I think about when he gets there and all the things that happen throughout the years, and he's going to serve God for many years. A lot of folks believe as late as 85, 90 years of age. But what you see with Daniel is he blooms where he was planted. He didn't choose to be planted in Babylon. But he says, you know what, I'm going to serve God wherever I am. And I think about Paul's statement. We looked at it this morning. In fact, Philippians 4:11, where he says, I've learned in whatsoever state I am to be content. Doesn't mean you always like it, but I find a way to roll with it, to be flexible. As we've said many times before, somebody has said, blessed are the flexible, for they shall not be bent out of shape. But his disposition was just, he was not a complainer. And it's a fact that negativity, complaining, murmuring, it tends to breed what? More negativity, murmuring, and complaining. And so if I can have a good disposition, whatever my circumstances, I'm more likely to help others to do the same as well, and especially my own children, my own family. Again, Philippians 2:14, Paul says, do all things without murmuring and complaining. And just having a better disposition. That's something we can learn from Daniel. 3, Daniel was a convicted and courageous person. So were his friends. In fact, Daniel 3:16 and following, when the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, however you want to refer to them, when they're called on the carpet for not bowing to Nebuchadnezzar's image when the music played, and Nebuchadnezzar essentially says to them, we're going to do this again. We're going to have a replay, give you a mulligan here, and you fall down and worship my image, and everything's going to be cool, and we're just going to forget this ever happened. But oh, if you don't, you just tell me boys, who is that God that will save you from me? And it's almost like God in heaven is saying, well, interesting you should ask that, Nebuchadnezzar, because he'll find out who that God is. But the boys said to Nebuchadnezzar, we're not careful to answer you in this matter, O king. We don't have to think about this, king. And they're not being smart alecks. They're just saying we are convicted. And they were courageous. And as we've said before, courage is not necessarily the absence of fear. In fact, many times fear is what makes courage courage, because it's doing what you should do even though you're afraid. I think it was John Wayne that I'd read one time that he said, courage is being scared to death and saddling up anyway. They were convicted. So was Daniel. Even if he's got to stand alone, Daniel's going to stand, and you'll see that's Monday night when Daniel first gets into captivity, and he's not going to eat the king's food, drink the king's wine. He's going to stand, even if he has to stand all alone. He's going to have to tell unpleasant things to Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar's going to have a dream. That's not part of our study. But in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar's going to have a dream, and Daniel's kind of like, oh boy, I got bad news for you, king. This dream, the interpretation, the way the King James words it is something like, it belongs to your enemies. I was trying to remember the exact wording, because it's kind of an interesting way of putting it. 19, chapter 4, verse 19. My Lord, the dream be to them that hate thee, and the interpretation thereof to thine enemies. In other words, your enemies are really going to like what I'm about to say, because the kingdom's going to be taken from you for a time, and you're going to have some hard times coming here. But Daniel, he did it. Belshazzar, chapter 5, that'll be Wednesday night, Lord willing. He had to tell Belshazzar some hard things. Chapter 6, when he was told not to pray, that'll be Thursday night, God willing. Again, courage and conviction often are contagious. We would do well to spread them around freely. But Daniel understood it's better to be right with God and at odds with humans if that's what it takes. We want to try to live in harmony with everybody. But when it comes down to it, make sure you please God. And then Daniel had that conviction, that courage that he was going to do that. Jesus says, don't fear those that kill the body but can't kill the soul. Fear him which is able to destroy both soul and body in hell, Matthew 10:28. Number 4, Daniel did not retire from God's service. He's going to serve into the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Chapter 10, verse 1 tells us. Scholars tell us that would be somewhere around 535 BC. Again, this was on into his old age. When he's in the lion's den, he's not a young boy. I've seen that depicted in pictures as if he's just a young man. No. He would be on up in years. But there he is. He's still serving God. Daring to be a Daniel means I don't retire from God's service. I don't know that I've ever heard it said to me. I've heard of people saying things like, let the younger folks do this, let the younger folks do that. I put in my time. I'm taking a break from that. May it never be so. There's a song that we sometimes sing, In Christ Alone. And the song, one part of the song says, till he returns or calls me home. Here in the power of Christ, I'll stand. That's being a Daniel. Serving God on into old age. Bringing forth fruit in old age, Psalm 92:14. And then finally, number 5, Daniel always gave God the credit. He always gave God the glory. Whether it's interpreting a dream, whether it's having to deliver some bad news, whether it's delivering some good news. And all that he did, he gave God the credit. He gave God the glory. We've studied before from 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 30, where the prophet there, God made the statement to the prophet Samuel, them that honor me, I will honor, and them that despise me shall be lightly esteemed. The New Testament version of that is, or at least similar, is James 4:10. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up. There's so much we can learn from Daniel. Let's dare to be a Daniel. And summing all that up is it's being faithful to the Lord no matter what, till the day I leave this earth or the Lord returns, whichever comes first. But being faithful begins with being a child of God. And so we want to take a moment here to extend heaven's invitation. If you're not a child of God, if you're not a Christian, if you believe with all your heart that Jesus is the Christ, the one hope, you're willing to confess before others, I believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God. If you are so convicted that you're willing to surrender your will, your life to Him in repentance, you could be baptized into Christ. And we'll put off our ice cream supper for just a few moments so we can see a soul added by the Lord to His church, to His kingdom, that everlasting kingdom, and you can be part of the family of God and have a new start, a new life. Maybe that you're a child of God and maybe you're not where you need to be spiritually. Maybe you just need encouragement from your brothers and sisters. But as we extend heaven's invitation, if we can help you in any way, as we said this morning, there are examples in Scripture that are given to us to say kind of a cautionary tale. So just watch out. Don't do that. Don't make these mistakes. Learn from those mistakes. And then there are examples in Scripture that's like God saying to us, flashing lights, hey, here is one of my servants that you can follow and emulate. And you'll follow that example right into heaven. Let's be a congregation, a family of God filled with Daniels. Can we help you in some way? If so, come while we stand and sing to encourage you.